Welcome. Thanks for joining me. My name is Dr. Zanna van der A, and my goal is to guide you through the sense and nonsense of customer and employee experience. Why me? Why am I suitable to do that? Because I'm almost 25 years working in customer experience, and I've successfully run several multi-year CX transformation programs, and I'm combining that with a PhD in customer experience. So that unique combination of science and pragmatic implementation experience is why I can help you understand, hey, what are all the hypes in customer experience, but also what are the things that really help you understand how you can be more successful and really have more business impact in CX. So today, I'm going to walk you through the ultimate guide of CX and EX metrics. Why starting this guide on the metrics? Because what I've seen is to be successful in CX transformation, one of the key starting points is that the organization really knows, okay, what has the biggest impact for both customers and employees? Because if that's not clear, then you start improving, but you either don't see the effect, or it's really difficult to convince the organization to prioritize their time, because you cannot really prove, hey, investing our time in, for example, personal attention, will get us 3 times faster to business impact than if we, for example, enhance the ease of doing things. So that's why metrics are crucial. And I also see a lot of companies struggling with, okay, I know we have the NPS, satisfaction and the customer effort score, but when exactly do I use which metric? So I'm going to start with a brief history of these 3 metrics, and then walk you through the sense and nonsense, the challenges, but also the tips on how to use them for each of the 3. Starting with NPS, then the customer effort score, and finally with satisfaction. Okay, a brief history on the 3. So for many, many years, let's say science has chosen satisfaction. So satisfaction was measured on a scale of 1 to 10. How satisfied are you with something like the services of the organization? Why satisfaction? Because it was a very good predictor of loyalty. Loyalty meaning I do more business with you, I do longer business with you. So that's where the financial impact of experience lies. So for many years, an 8+ in satisfaction, right, an 8 score or a 9 score, had a very strong relationship with loyalty. But the challenge was that many organizations, they didn't really see an increase in satisfaction. So for years, they were measuring satisfaction, and it was always between this 7.4, 7.6. And instead of them thinking maybe I'm not improving the right things that matter most to customers, they started questioning the metric as such. So in 2003, Frederick Reichheld, he introduced the Net Promoter Score. He wrote a book, The Ultimate Question, and he introduced a metric that would be more easy and more impactful to measure loyalty. And I will go through the details later, but that was around 2003. And a lot of companies jumped on that option because it was way easier to measure just one metric for loyalty, instead of having a lot of questions and calculations to understand, okay, how loyal are my customers? So a lot of companies, I think you probably know, I think right now, there's hardly any company that's not measuring NPS. So from that perspective, super successful, also marketing around the NPS. And then in 2013, a book was launched called The Effortless Experience by Matthew Dixon, and they introduced the customer effort score. The idea there was, again, that maybe NPS is not the best predictor. So what, again, is a good predictor for loyalty? And they figured out, based on their research, but I'll dive into that a little more later as well, that this level of effort was an even better predictor of loyalty. So that's sort of the history of the 3 metrics. And each of the metric has their pros and cons. But for me, it's really important to help you understand, okay, when do I use which metric? And what are the challenges that you need to be aware of? Okay, we're ready to dive in the first one. So, the Net Promoter Score. I think it's the most popular metric for all companies across the globe. So the Net Promoter Score, just to remind you, is the question, would you recommend company X to friends and family? And it's measured on a scale of 0 to 10. And then the score is the percentage of 9 and 10 minus the percentage of 0 and 6. So you get like a plus 10 or a minus 20, right? That's the Net Promoter Score. But to understand how it's being used today, we also need to have a tiny trip back to memory lane on the history of the Net Promoter Score. Because originally, the goal of NPS was very different. So Mr. Reichelt, he has a history, and he, by the way, wrote a very good book. It's called I think it's the Loyalty Effect, already in '96, where he proved the financial impact of loyalty. If you haven't read that, you definitely should. So he has always been researching on how can we enhance loyalty of customers and employees. And at one point he was talking to a company, and that company was telling him that, hey, we're using a metric around recommendation. And that company had discovered that when they asked that question, would you recommend us? That question had a very strong relationship with the profitability of that customer. So it was in a B2B context. So it's important for you to remember the NPS used to be a metric to predict profitability. So Reichelt found that a very interesting example, started doing more research, and he indeed could repeat that, hey, that question indeed is very well linked to profitability. But now, fast forward almost 20 years later, the NPS is no longer used as a metric for profitability, and now it's really a full mechanism to understand, hey, what are the root causes behind NPS, and what topics do I need to improve to enhance NPS? So that's a very different application of the Net Promoter Score. And that's where I think a lot of things go wrong that you need to be aware of if you want to use the Net Promoter Score. And so just remember, the original goal was very different. Now everybody's using it to understand, okay, should we enhance the speed of doing things? Should we enhance personal attention? So I'm going to walk you through the different challenges and risks that you need to be aware of when you want to start using NPS. Issue number 1. If you've been using NPS, you probably have experienced its volatility, right? It's plus 10 in Q1, it's minus 10 in Q2, and it's very hard to understand, okay, but what's causing this volatility? Well, part of that volatility is just caused by the calculation, because you're ignoring the 7 and 8 scores, which tend to be mostly, the most customers choose 7 and 8. There only has to be a very tiny change in the 9 or 10 percentage or the 0 to 6 to already have a big increase or decrease in NPS. A solution to that I often advise is to also have this shadow metric that's just the average NPS. So that's the 7.3 or the 7.4, like a satisfaction score. So at least you have a sanity check that's less volatile. But that volatility is also connected to 2 levels how you can use the NPS. So you have the relational NPS, that's on a brand level. Would you recommend company X as a whole? But more and more companies are using something that's called a transactional NPS. So they're using it after, for example, an interaction. So would you recommend us based on this phone call that we had? Well, if you use it in a transactional sense, then it gets even more volatile. Because for me, to recommend something, I'm never just judging that call, right? I'm judging a lot of things. So I would definitely advise against using the NPS as a transactional metric. That's where you can better use satisfaction, but I'll explain that later. So that's the first challenge, right? It's volatility. The second challenge, and I think a more important challenge, is the whole challenge around really understanding what drives NPS, the so-called root cause analysis. And there are a few reasons why the root cause analysis, so I'm always saying you can use NPS if you want to, but just delete the root cause analysis for a few reasons. The first reason is that most NPS measurements are asking the would you recommend us question, and then an open text, for example. And they ask why. Why do you give this score? So I start thinking about it. I start thinking, I'm giving it 8 because, I don't know, Pete was really friendly. So I start rationalizing my answer, while we as human beings are not very rational people. So you run the risk of analyzing all these open texts, but you're analyzing all the rational answers. So you might think that you've discovered the drivers, but the subconscious emotional needs of customers can be very different. So even if now all the tooling companies are saying, hey, we have smart AI that can analyze thousands of open answers, you're still analyzing the rational answers. So be aware of that risk, right? The risk of analyzing open answers that will not give you the latent subconscious needs of customers. That's one challenge. The second challenge is that often you also have a list of root causes. So you ask the NPS question, would you recommend us? And then you get a list of, was it connected to sales or to customer service? And the problem there is that you have no idea to know, okay, that list that we have, is it complete? Are we asking all the topics that matter most to customers? And I had a very good example recently where a company came up to me and said, hey Zanna, recently we added a reason number 7. And we're really happy that we chose that reason because a lot of customers chose that in the previous research. I said, great, that's amazing. But how do you know for sure that there's not a reason 8 or 9 or 10? And so you don't know if you're asking the right topics. That's a challenge when it comes to the root cause. So that's a second problem, right? So the volatility, it's the often the rational side, not the emotional side. And you're not sure, okay, am I complete? Am I measuring? So it's the three issues so far, not just the 2. Then another way how the NPS is often being used is something that's called direct feedback. So direct feedback would mean that whenever a customer, for example, gives a 5 or lower, you send that signal to, for example, a call center employee, and they call the customer and ask, hey Zanna, what happened? Right? What can we do to restore your confidence, to restore your experience? A lot of companies overestimate the impact of direct feedback. Let me do a short calculation. Let's say you're sending 100% of your customers a survey. In reality, it will be lower, but just for the exercise, let's assume it's 100%. Let's assume 20% respond, which is very high, right? This will also be lower in reality. Let's assume that from the 20%, only 25% is unhappy. That means that if you would call all these customers, you're still only impacting 5% of your whole customer base. And in reality, it will be way lower. And so the impact of direct feedback, while it has a very big impact operationally, it doesn't have a very big impact on customers. Then you can say, okay, we understand that, but we can improve based on the impact that we're getting out of these calls, right? The feedback that customers are giving us. You could, but then you have the same risks as I just discussed with the open answers, that customers might say it's about, I don't know, the speed of doing things or the price, while in essence, that's not really what's their issue. And so be careful to really understand what matters most to customers. So looking at NPS, right, summarizing, if you want to use it, and I say this with a big if, but if you want to use it, only use it for brand experience, so on a relational level, only once, maximum twice a year, as sort of this sanity check. The sanity check, are we moving in the right direction? Because all the journeys and all the channels you are measuring constantly to enhance the experience as a whole. If you use it then once a year, also only ask the NPS question. Don't ask any root causes because of the challenges I just mentioned. Just do it as a temperature check. And then once a year, measure it. Don't measure it on a transactional level. Use satisfaction, as I'll be explaining later on. And then just use it as a guide, right? As a rough guide. Okay, the recommendation is increasing, but we're not really taking action on it. We do that on different levels. Just one thing before I forget and we switch to the customer effort score. I've also created a slide share video where I explain the metrics connected to the 5 types of experience. So I split the CX transformation into 5 types: brand experience, customer experience, employee experience, service experience, and user experience. And I'm also explaining in that slide share, okay, for each type of experience, which of these 3 metrics are the best combination. So if you also want to have some visuals, just check out, we'll put the link in the notes as well. Check out that slide share video. So we just explained everything you need to know about the Net Promoter Score. That's by far the most popular metric. But also now the Customer Effort Score is getting more and more traction. So I think you also need to know, okay, when and how do I best use it? But also understand a bit the history and the context of the Customer Effort Score. So as I mentioned in the introduction, it was launched in 2013 through the book The Effortless Experience. If you haven't read it, apart from the Customer Effort Score, it's definitely a tip also to read, because they also did a lot of experiments on just even the wording. So when call center agents are talking to customers, how big the impact is by just wording things differently. So definitely also a reading tip. But the context of the Customer Effort Score was indeed in the call center setting, so in interactions with customers. And what they discovered is that the ease or the effort that it takes, at least the perception of effort that customers have to do something or to get answer to their question, or for example to fill in an online form, that it has a huge impact on loyalty, or at least the perception of loyalty again from customers. And there was a study by Harvard Business Review where they compared the impact of NPS, Customer Effort Score, and satisfaction on loyalty, on let's say repeat purchases. And they found that the Customer Effort Score was a better predictor than the Net Promoter Score. So I think at that time I was working for an insurance company in the Netherlands. And as you may have heard from the story around the NPS, you could probably read a little, I'm not the biggest fan of NPS. So I was really excited when I learned about the Customer Effort Score, because it also makes sense, right? Of course, how easier things are, I can imagine I'm more satisfied. But stubborn as we are, we thought, hey, it's Harvard Business Review, maybe we should just double check if we can reproduce that study. So we did the same study, but from our results, we saw that the Customer Effort Score was the worst predictor of loyalty. And we saw that NPS and satisfaction, they were the biggest predictors. Well, as I'm also a fan of satisfaction, as I will explain in the last part, we thought, okay, let's continue then with satisfaction, but let's use the effort, the ease of doing things as a driver of satisfaction. So we always take ease of doing things into our surveys, but then we see how big is the impact of easiness on satisfaction. We'll dive more into that later. So we could not reproduce it. So my conclusion when it comes to the Customer Effort Score is that you should not use it for customer service. So when you're measuring the satisfaction with call or with chat, our advice is to use it with satisfaction. But the Customer Effort Score is a really valuable metric to use for user experience. So remember those 5 types of experience? So brand, customer, employee, service, and UX. So on the digital side, that to me is where the Customer Effort Score is really valuable. So on the app, on the website, or the My Account. And then the way you use the Customer Effort Score, so the Customer Effort Score is also on a scale, sometimes 5 or a 7-point scale. How easy is it to do something? And then completely disagree to completely agree. But here the key is also to place the Customer Effort Score question on a very specific, let's say, functional place in your app, for example. So that you can make the question really specific and say, the app makes it easy for me to check my invoice, for example. Right? So the tool, the app, the website makes it easy for me to do X. Then, if you maybe remember from my NPS explanation, that there's a risk of using open answers, right? Open question. Here, with the Customer Effort Score, because it's so transactional and it's so specific, Here you don't have any issues using an open question. So with the NPS, it's not transactional, right? Me recommending something is also emotional. So there, open answers are a risk. But here with a customer effort score, you can easily say, okay, the app made it easy for me to check my invoice. Based on the score, you get a follow-up open question. For example, if the customer rates you a 5 out of 5, you can say, hey, great, that's amazing. What's one thing that made it super easy for you? If customers give a 3 or 4, hey, that's a nice score. Can you maybe give us one tip how we can do it better? And if it's a 1 or 2, you could maybe say, we're sorry about having a bad experience. Again, can you give us one example what we could have done to make it easier? So then you get, again, a lot of open texts, but this is where you definitely can use AI to start understanding, okay, what are the key topics? Because again, it's a very transactional question. So you get also very concrete tips where it's very easy to use AI to see, okay, what are the top 3 topics? You start improving and then you keep measuring it. So you see indeed, hey, the effort or the easiness is increasing. Also here important, what I tend to see a lot of companies do is they measure it on a lot of different places on the website or in the app. But then there's no team or there's nobody that's actually doing something with the insights. And so then you're just measuring for measuring's sake. So my advice is also always already start talking to the team that is, let's say, your internal customer of the insights to see, okay, which pages or which places in the app or the website are, for example, the top 3 places used by customers, and start experimenting with the customer effort score in that specific location. Measure those top 3 places, start improving, and once that's working, then see, hey, what are also other places in the app or the website where we can introduce the customer effort score. So to summarize, the origin of the customer effort score is in the service context, right, in the call center. We were not able to reproduce that, so our advice is to say not use it for service experience, use it on the digital side for user experience, and make it really tangible and transactional where you place the customer effort score with open text to understand one tip for each customer, how you can make it more easy. All right, so we just discussed 2 out of the 3 key CX metrics, the Net Promoter Score and the customer effort score. How and when to use them. Right? So Net Promoter Score, if you're measuring it, do it with brand experience. Customer effort score, if you're measuring it, use it for UX, user experience. So the third one that's left, and let's say the original one, is satisfaction. So from a scientific perspective, satisfaction for me is still a very good metric, because what we see from an 8+ score, there's still a very good relationship with loyalty, right? It's predicting the financial impact of customer experience. And it's always on a scale of 1 to 10. How satisfied are you with applying for a job X? How satisfied are you with calling customer service? So as you can see, based on these examples, I use satisfaction on customer experience and on service experience. So these are places where companies tend to use the transactional NPS. As I mentioned in the NPS part, I'm not a fan. I would advise against using the transactional NPS because it's way too volatile, but also there are way more things that I think about when I recommend. You can say, okay, would you recommend us based on this phone call? But I'm not only using that phone call. So for me, I'm still a fan of satisfaction for journeys and for channels. And maybe also the reason behind that is, so we've discussed all the 3 metrics. I think what's important to know is that there's never one holy metric. And so even though Reichheld called his book The Ultimate Question, he himself in his book is already sort of disclaiming that by saying at the end, well, of course, you need several metrics at the same time, right? That's not just one question and you are steering successfully CX transformation. And so we use these 5 types of experience to have a good mix of the different metrics. But the key to whatever metrics you use is to understand, okay, but what is the fastest way to enhance that metric? So what really drives satisfaction? What really drives NPS? And so as I explained, the root cause analysis for NPS is not the best way of doing that. So this is a nice cliffhanger for the next part of the video, because that's where I'll be explaining, okay, but how can you find those drivers? What's the best way to understand? How can I prove, hey, personal attention, for example, is 5 times more impactful than ease of doing things? And that technique is both applicable, of course, for satisfaction, but also for NPS. So I'll leave you for now on that cliffhanger. Feel free to grab a coffee or a tea, and then I'll see you in the next part. So you just learned about the key metrics in customer experience. But as you maybe learned from the first part, the key is not so much the metric. Of course, you need to understand where and when am I using which metric and what are the pluses and minuses of each of the metrics. But the key, and I think what's going wrong in maybe 95% of all CX transformation programs, is okay, but how do I find what has the biggest impact to improve satisfaction or to improve the Net Promoter Score? So that's where the so-called drivers come in. So for me, as part of my PhD, I had to do, unfortunately, a lot of statistics. So I always say you want to use smart statistics to really prove what has the biggest impact. Why are these statistics relevant? Because too often in customer experience, the analysis that are being done is, let's say, still too fluffy for the rest of the organization. What do I mean by that? There's a lot of qualitative research, for example, in CX. So there are interviews with 8 to 10 customers, but the rest of the organization is used to have hard steerable sales data, operational data. So when you get to them saying, hey, 8 customers are saying they need more personal attention, then often the feedback, whether it's explicit or implicit, is, yeah, but it's only 8 customers. So how do we know for sure that this has the biggest impact? So one of my key searches across all these 25 years is how can I transform this soft element of CX and also employee experience into hard steerable data, because I need to speak the language of the organization. Right? I need to find a way to have experience data on the same level as sales or operations. So that's why we're using, I always say, smart statistics. I'm going to walk you through how you can do this. If it becomes too technical, I'll try to make it very simple. But just know that some parts, like the statistical analysis, you don't have to do that yourself. Right? You can find an agency, or I'm happy to share the agency that we are working with, that can just run the statistics for you. But for me, it's crucial for you as a successful, right? If you want to have business impact, you really need to understand which kind of insights that you need to convince the rest of the organization. Okay, let's dive into it. So how does it work? So when we create a so-called driver analysis, we go through several steps. First step is always that we say choose one journey to do this driver analysis, prove its added value, and then take it from there. So choose a journey. Let's say we choose the journey of applying for an insurance, right? I need a new car insurance, for example. So the first step that we do is that we plan a journey mapping workshop. And also the journey mapping workshop, so we don't do journey mappings for 2 or 3 months. We map a journey in 2 to 2.5 hours. So it's one workshop, and we'll also be recording the ultimate guide to journey mapping and management, where I'll go into more detail. But we use that that workshop to understand with all the different departments that play a role in that journey. So we have employees from the call center, from marketing, from finance, from the back office. Right? So really each department that plays a role is in that workshop. And then I always say I'm just going to ask stupid questions from the perspective of the customer. So 80% of that workshop are the transactional steps. I go to the website, I fill in a form. Do I get a confirmation email? Yes. What's in that confirmation email? And then you already will experience that people say, we don't know. The computer, right, is sending this confirmation. So we go through all the steps, again, from the customer perspective. So it doesn't matter how complex the internal processes are. That's 80% of the workshop. Then 20% of the workshop is around the emotional side of the experience of customers. This is often forgotten in many metrics. So also NPS, root cause analysis, tends to be very transactional. So on that part, you do two things. You think about, thinking about our brand promise. For example, if our promise is around personal attention, you also want to see how can we make sure this journey is very personal. And the second part is that you ask all the participants, just shout out whatever emotion you want the customer to experience. I don't know. I think they want to be treated with respect. I think things should be super clear. It should be trustworthy, right? So you get a whole list of emotions. Those two ingredients, so the transactional steps of the journey plus the emotional, we design into a survey. It's not a short survey. That's a pretty long survey. 30, 40 statements are no exception, because you want to make sure that each of these steps of the journey are captured in that survey, because we want to figure out, from all these steps, both transactional and emotional, which ones have the biggest impact on, normally we use satisfaction, but we've also experimented with NPS, and it can work in the same way. But just in this example, I'll be using satisfaction. So we have a long survey. We send that survey to customers who have recently experienced that journey. Recently meaning minimum a week ago, so not like 5 minutes after the journey has happened, right? There needs to be some time lag. Maximum 4 weeks ago. So also not 3 months ago, because then I don't remember exactly what the journey looked like. So between 1 and 4 weeks ago, send out the survey, and as soon as you have 100 or more filled out surveys back, then you can run these so-called smart statistics. So you can get an export, for example, from the research company, and then you let somebody, or maybe you have a data scientist who can run the statistics. But there are 3 analyses that we do, that you can also start applying. So what smart statistics are we using? The first step is called factor analysis. And again, this might become a bit technical, but I want you to understand the business relevance of the analysis that we're using. So I will always explain briefly the statistical analysis, but then explain, about what is the value of that analysis. So the first step is called factor analysis. What does that do? So these 30, 40 statements, we organize the survey in the order of the journey. So we start with some statements about the application form, for example, then some statements about an account manager that's visiting me, etc. The factor analysis is telling us that customers are saying, it's nice that these are the order of the steps, but for me, statement 1, 3, 10, and 15 belong together. Hey, all these statements have something to do with personal attention. So remember also from the NPS explanation that there's a risk of having the rational insights while you need the more latent subconscious needs. The factor analysis is the key to discovering those subconscious needs. So that's the first step. Then what you want to do is regression analysis, but not with all the statements, with the separate factors. That will tell you, so we found a factor of personal attention, we found a factor maybe the clarity of the process, you find a factor maybe something around the digital side. Regression analysis will tell you, factor 1 is 3 times more impactful than factor 2. This is where speaking the language of the organization comes in. Now you can say, we all have limited resources, we have limited time, but if you want to prioritize the maximum impact, investing all our energy, in this example, in personal attention, will enhance satisfaction or NPS 3 times faster than if we would now focus on, for example, the digital side of the journey. So that's where regression analysis plays a key role. What has the biggest impact? But another crucial metric that regression analysis will give you is something that's called explained variance. You can forget about that. But the business explanation for explained variance is, remember that in the NPS, I shared with you that you can make a list of 6 or 7 root causes, but how do you know for sure that you're complete? How do you know for sure that you ask the right questions? So this percentage explained variance is telling you, hey, from the customer perspective, did we cover all the topics that matter to them? If the explained variance is 40% or more, then you know for sure, okay, we didn't miss anything crucial. Our analysis tend to be between 50 and 70%, which is extremely high. So the methodology is always validating itself. If the explained variance is 30 or lower, then you know for sure you missed something in your journey workshop. Well, we've done these driver analysis, I think, over 250 times by now, across very different countries, very different sectors. And I think we only had one time where we had less than this 30%. And then what we found out is that it was not so much the survey, but the survey was sent to the wrong customers, right? So we sent the survey of Journey A to customers who just went through Journey B. And when we fixed that, then again, we were above 50% in explained variance. So this is a very good double check, because in the workshop, there are no customers present. So we always do the workshop only with employees, but a survey, of course, is being sent to customers. So you always have a very good sanity check. And just to give you an idea, the timeline from journey workshop to getting these drivers is 4 to 6 weeks. Depending, of course, on how many customers you can send the survey to, as to how quickly do you have 100 surveys back. But it can be a super fast process. And then when you have these statistics, you know the crucial business impact questions. Did we ask the right questions? Which topics have the biggest impact? But also, how are we valued by the customers right now? So biggest impact plus the customer score right now gives you a really clear prioritization. And I think what's important as a side note is that a lot of research companies, either they're not doing any statistical analysis, or they're using something around correlation. But causation, so cause and effect, and correlation are two very different things. That's important for you to know. And what's important, that they sometimes use this priority matrix. Maybe you recognize this, that on the top right are the things that have a good impact, but you're also already doing relatively well. And then they tend to advise you to sort of treasure that, right? So you don't need to improve it, but these are your, let's say, the golden parts of your journey. I advise otherwise. So we always do, we say, okay, let's say the personal attention element is 3 times more impactful than the statements around ease of doing things. Even if you're already scoring like a 3.9 or a 4.0 on a scale of 5, you still want to enhance that to a 4.4 or 4.5, because that will enhance your satisfaction or NPS 3 times faster than if you would start enhancing maybe the lower score on ease, but that has 3 times less impact. And so when you think about, okay, what do we need to improve to have the biggest impact, always combine impact score of the theme plus the actual valuation today. Because our human nature is to just quickly scan the results, and then we see, ooh, let's say the confirmation email has the lowest score. Ooh, we need to improve that. But now you will see that confirmation email is probably way less impactful than being there for the customer, or treat them as a person, not as a number. And so this gives you the hard, steerable information on this soft, fluffy thing called customer experience. One golden tip before I forget. So in the end, you get these statistics, right? So you get the results back where it says, you know, all the statements around personal attention are way more impactful. One of the key learnings that I had is when you present these results, and so we present the results also just in one slide. It's not a 30, 40 slide deck, it's just a 1 slide summary. And what I learned is when you present this to the board, for example, people will say, of course, We already do this. Of course, personal attention matters. So the impact was not as high to get them to start improving on it. So what we did, we said, okay, we're not going to share any results before we do first a Kahoot quiz. So a Kahoot quiz is always fun and everybody has a bit of competition. But the key, let's say, behavioral science and transformational impact of the Kahoot quiz is that you start asking questions like, what do you think is the biggest driver? Or you have, hey, true or false, waiting time is 2 times more impactful than personal attention, which is not. And then people say that they at least tend to have 50% of the questions wrong. Then they are, for the first time, truly open to listen, okay, but what are these drivers really telling us? And then also later, let's say 3 or 4 months later, when they start saying, yes, of course, this human aspect matters most, you can still remind them by saying, hey, remember, 60 to 70% of all of you thought it was more the transactional side. Because mostly they tend to think that transactional things are more impactful than the human aspects. So golden tip, always do a Kahoot quiz before you share the results. Having done, just zooming out a little, having done across, I think, 20 plus countries, over 250 driver analysis, what do we tend to see? So my dream, so why am I in CX transformation for almost 25 years, is because I want to make sure that companies treat people well, customers and employees. But that's a very fluffy and vague dream. So I needed to figure out, how do I prove that this human aspect really has the biggest impact? That's why we're now using these smart statistics. And what we see across all these countries, literally from Tokyo to Argentina, so very different cultures, we see that for both B2C, consumer side, also B2B, we see that this human aspect, treat me with respect, be there for me when I need you, give me personal attention, treat me like a person, not a number, that's the number one by far across all these countries. So this very human aspect, I think, it's such a, let's say, basic need on a human level that is not different in different cultures. So this number one is what we've seen across all these different sectors as well. And I think that's one of the beauty of doing these smart statistics, that now we figured out a way on how can we prove, speak the language organization, and say, hey, indeed, this human aspect will give us business impact, will give us financial results 3 times faster than if we start improving, let's say, the more transactional things. So that to me was a really, I think, most impactful finding of working internationally, that yes, this human thing not only matters most, but now we have a way to prove it. And what we've done every time, so of course statistics are still statistics, but every time when we start improving on those key drivers, in only 3 months' time, so pretty fast, we saw an increase in satisfaction, and also not just a 0.1 or 0.2, but a very steep increase in satisfaction. So it's not just theory, it's not just statistics. We've actually proven every time that yes, when you improve on those things, you actually see also the fastest results. So smart statistics might be a bit daunting, but it's really crucial to have this first step to be a really good business partner for the rest of your colleagues, so they can prioritize their very busy and their, let's say, limited resources on the things that have the biggest impact. So as you maybe know from previous podcasts that you've listened to, for me, if you want to be successful in CX transformation, it's impossible to do that without also good employee experience. So that's why in this part of the video, I'm going to explain to you how you can also find the drivers of employee experience to see, okay, but how can we create more emotional engagement with employees? As always, I'm going to start with helping you figure out, okay, what's the sense and nonsense when it comes to employee engagement? Because probably in your organization, you are using a so-called employee engagement tool, or a survey that's being used. And trust me, when it comes to that, there's a lot of nonsense going on. So I want you to be able to assess your own survey tooling better and walk you through the most critical issues that you need to be aware of. one of the first issues when it comes to employee engagement tools is how they are defining employee engagement. So often I see a mix of things. I see, for example, what's called the eNPS, so the Employee Net Promoter Score. And as you know, the normal NPS is on a scale of 0 to 10. So that's also for the eNPS. But here they create like a 5-point scale. So it's the eNPS, but then on a completely agree to completely disagree scale. That's kind of strange, in my opinion. Or there's a question on a 5-point scale, how happy employees are. And both of these statements, and the third option is, that they create an engagement, what they call an engagement index. So they use, for example, 4 statements, the eNPS, the satisfaction question, do you think you'll be working here in the next couple of years? And then they average that score and say, okay, this is measuring employee engagement. All of these 3 ways of measuring employee engagement have nothing to do with the scientific way of measuring employee engagement. Well, why does it matter? Because, of course, you can say that's a scientific debate. But if you're not actually measuring engagement, you're never going to find the drivers that have the biggest impact on engagement. And that's in the end the goal, right? You want to figure out what topics do we need to improve to enhance the engagement of employees. The good news, this definition of the scientific definition of engagement is readily available. So also for my PhD, I had to use, you have to use existing scientific scales. So this is just an existing scale that you can use. We also share that with everyone, right? That's no secret. And employee engagement, so the emotional side of engagement, is measured through 3 statements like, I feel at home at company X. I care about the long-term success of company X. Right? So 3 super simple statements that you can also start using in your own research. So the first tip, really double check in your engagement tool, how are they defining and measuring engagement? That's one part. The other part is how they, because it tends to be like 30 different statements or 30 different topics that they tend to ask. But the question is, how do they get to what has the biggest impact? So what I tend to see is either they share no drivers, so they do no analysis. They just report the lowest scores and you start improving the lowest scores. Or they do something where they say, hey, this is a driver. But then what tends to happen is 2 things. Either they use correlation, and maybe as you've learned from the previous parts of this video, correlation is not the same as cause and effect, so be very careful there. But also what they tend to do is that they base the prioritization on a benchmark. Because these tools, they often have global tools, and one of their USPs, their unique selling points, is that they say, hey, but you can benchmark your scores with other industry organizations, for example. So then what they tend to do is that, let's say you have a question around salary, for example. They compare your score to the benchmark, and then they say if your score is lower than the benchmark, then salary becomes a driver for you to improve. If your score on salary is higher than the benchmark, then they say that's fine, you don't need to improve because you're already above the benchmark. But the big issue here is that this benchmark is not telling you anything about how important salary in this case is for your employees. So if, for example, for all the employees in this sector, salary would be a key driver, then even if you already have a pretty good score, you want to enhance that because this is the biggest impact that you can make. And so here also double check, okay, but how is this tool defining, okay, when is something a driver? And I'm going to walk you now through how you can use, again, smart statistics, so you can know what questions you need to ask or how you can assess your survey tooling company or the employee engagement tool to really challenge them, okay, but how are they getting to the best insights? Again, why relevant? Because you have limited resources, you have specific priorities you want to improve, and you want to make sure that you choose the ones that matter most to your employees. Okay, so looking at how you get to these drivers. So the good news compared to the drivers that we just discussed for customers is that on the employee side, there's already a very good baseline that you can use. So based on my PhD, based on existing employee engagement research, let's say 60-70% of the survey is generic. Because topics like empowerment, topics like meaning and purpose, they are generic across all employees of any company. So you already can use a good baseline. And then what you want to do is that you want to have a workshop where you start mapping the employee journey. Also here in that workshop, it's maybe 2.5 hours, and you make sure that you have a mix of, let's say, employees who were recently started at the company, employees who have been there for maybe 5 or 6 years, a few team leaders, a few managers, and colleagues from HR. So again, that you have everybody in the room that covers the employee journey. Then you go and ask a lot of questions about, okay, what do employees experience? And the key here is that you want to find a balance of, let's say, HR topics, things like training, things like development opportunities, but also the daily journey of the employee. So what I tend to see is that most employee engagement tools, they are very focused on, let's say, the transactional side of HR. What's missing is, okay, but what does my daily work look like, and how are topics like customer experience or the impact that I'm making on others or purpose, how are they integrated in my daily work? So we check the HR topics, we check the daily journey, and then we tweak this baseline that we have, right, the 60-70% with all the generic topics, and we finalize the survey. Just like with customers, this is not a very short survey. It could be easily 40 to 50 statements, because again, we want to double check, okay, from all these topics, what has the biggest impact on the emotional engagement of employees? This very long survey is a one-off. So you do one time the very long survey, then you use again these smart statistics, and you come to a top 10, top 12 statements that have the biggest impact, and then you measure that top 12 on a regular basis, right? So you don't have to measure the 50 statements every time, you do that one time. This immediately also reminds me of the frequency. And so I see a lot of tooling companies push for more frequent surveys. It's often called a pulse check. So a lot of companies say, hey, maybe I want to measure it on a monthly basis, because right now it's like once a year. And once a year is also, for me, that's not enough. Right? Then it becomes sort of a check in the box. Okay, for our certification, we've done an employee engagement survey. But once a month, that comes a bit from, you know, the feedback of customers, where you also want to measure continuously. For customers, that makes sense because you can often quickly improve. But also there we advise do it once a quarter because you need time to improve. But for employees, the topics that matter most to them are often more, let's say, abstract. So for example, if you want to enhance their sense of purpose, because that's a key driver, you don't fix that within 4 weeks. So on the employee engagement side, we tend to advise measure it twice a year. So once every 6 months, because once a year is not creating a rhythm. Once a quarter tends to be too frequent. So twice a year you keep the rhythm going while you have enough time to also work on the more, let's say, complex topics like purpose. So that's the context on the frequency. So when you discover these drivers, then again you can use those drivers on multiple levels. So you can use these drivers to redesign the employee journey. Let's say again that a sense of purpose, because that's one of the things that we often see, is that what matters to employees, it's never about salary. It's never about the transactional stuff. It is about growth and opportunities. But a key topic tends to be around purpose or meaningful work. Or for me, it's clear the impact that I'm making on customers. And that's what I love because for me, the goal of CX transformation in the end is to create this human-centric culture. And that human-centric culture consists of customers, employees, and purpose. And these three are beautifully intertwined, because what we see is that often the number one thing that matters to customers tends to be on the human side, personal attention, be there for me, which is directly connected to the sense of purpose of employees, because that's often the reason why they chose to work for this organization. But due to a lot of KPIs on time spent or operations or sales, employees have also lost track a bit of this personal connection that they can make with customers. So when you find the drivers of customers and you find the drivers of employees, you see that purpose, customers, and employees are beautifully intertwined. So you can use the drivers to start redesigning, for example, the onboarding. So when we look at the first day of onboarding, how often are we explaining the purpose of the company? How often are we talking about customers and how they matter to us? Are we asking employees, hey, this is a challenge that we have in a specific journey? Maybe you can brainstorm how you can improve it. As you can really make these more abstract topics like purpose very concrete in each step of the journey. So that's one part, to use the drivers to redesign the employee journey. The other really valuable part is that you can use these drivers to start crafting leadership behaviors. And so what tiny habits can leaders do to enhance the sense of purpose, to enhance my feeling that I'm impacting customers? And also here the advice is that you need to help leaders to translate those drivers. And so a few years ago, I thought, okay, if I just share the drivers, then they will have enough ideas, okay, but what behaviors can I connect to these drivers? In my experience, what I tend to see is that leaders are always willing and open to adopt habits and activities, but it's really a struggle for them, okay, but what can I do? So what we tend to do is, for example, make a menu of really like 10 super tangible tiny steps that they can do to enhance this sense of purpose. For example, hey, what if every morning I start my day by asking one of my team members, maybe calling them, hey, thinking back about last week, when was the moment where you felt you had the biggest impact on a customer? And so these are not like huge things that take a lot of your time, but they are really crucial in starting to plant the seeds where employees feel that, hey, we're actually working on the topics that matter most to us. So again, to summarize, if you want to find the drivers that matter most for emotional engagement, double check the definition of engagement in your survey tool, really understand the technique that they're using to figure out what really drives it, and then use those drivers to redesign the journey and help the leadership to make their role in making CX transformation a success and enhance the emotional engagement of employees even more concrete into very specific habits and activities. So in the previous two parts of the video, you've learned about smart statistics, and that smart statistics really matter to make sure that you really find those topics that matter most to customers and employees. And what I've learned along the way is that when you're working in CX or EX, most professionals, of course, don't have this background in statistics, which is absolutely understandable. But as I've explained before, I think understanding some basic statistics are crucial to speak the language of the organization and to translate these insights and experience into hard, steerable data. So in this part of the video, I'm going to share two things. I'm going to start by explaining 5, let's say, key statistics metrics that you need to understand to make sure that you're measuring the right thing. And I'm also going to share 5 metrics that I think are really valuable, but that hardly anybody is using. So I'm happy to share those tips because I think you can easily implement them in your organization as well. So the first thing that's really important when it comes to statistics is the response rate. And what I tend to see is that the response rate, the impact of the response rate is overrated. So a lot of times I get a question, but hey, if there's only 10% of customers or employees responding, isn't that way too low or should it be higher? But the key to the response is not the percentage as such. Just think about when there are voting polls, right? They are asking 1,000 people and then they extrapolate that for 10 million civilians in a country. So it's not so much about the percentage, it's about the net number of responses. So let's say if my response rate is 50%, 50, but that only means I have 20 customers, I cannot do any statistical analysis. If I have 5% response on 100,000 customers, then quickly calculating, I have 5,000 responses. And so I can do a lot of statistical analysis. And so the net number of responses is more important than the percentage. And of course, what also matters is that not so much the percentage, but is it a representation of your customer base? So let's say if you have 50% response, but they're all female, while in your customer base it's 50% male and female, then of course it's nice that you have 50% response, but then it's not a valid representation. So response percentage as such is not as crucial. It's more relevant that it's a good representation and that the net numbers are high enough. The second tip is when you want to understand what has the biggest impact, you see a mix of 3 different techniques. So the most basic techniques that happens also in NPS root cause is that they just count the number of times that, for example, the invoice was mentioned. They assume the number of times that something is mentioned. The more it's mentioned, the more relevant it is. This is definitely not the best way to figure out cause and effect. The second approach is that they tend to use correlation. And correlation, again, is not the same as cause and effect. So correlation is saying there is a relation, but it doesn't mean that A influences B. And the example that I like to use is that's often also done in NPS research, where they compare the NPS. So let's say in your research you've asked something about the ease of using the app. And then what some researchers do is they say, okay, let's compare the NPS for customers that were very unhappy with the app with customers that were very happy about the app. And then they show that, hey, the NPS of customers that are very happy with the app is really high, I don't know, plus 60. And the customers that were unhappy, their NPS is minus 50. Hey, that's a huge difference. So apparently the ease of the app is really crucial for the NPS. To challenge that approach, what I did with that specific organization, I said, okay, let me just use 3 or 4 other statements from that same study, do the same exercise, and what you see is that across all the statements, it doesn't matter which statement I'm choosing. In each statement you see, okay, customers that were unhappy about that statement have a way lower NPS than customers that were happy about that statement. So also here, correlation, not the same as causation. So if you're looking for cause and effect, that's always our advice. You want to find the drivers and understand, hey, improving personal attention is 5 times more impactful than ease of doing things. That's where you want to use these smart statistics like regression analysis. That's really giving you the drivers and the cause and effect analysis. The third thing that you need to know about is when it comes to doing research is when to use qualitative research and when to use quantitative research. I see too many CX professionals leaning too heavy on qualitative research and not using enough quantitative research, or, as I just mentioned in step 2, not using the right analysis on the quantitative research. So when to use what? So when you want to find the drivers and understand what has the biggest impact, you want to use that smart statistics and quantitative research. That will tell you, again, it becomes a bit boring, but in the example, personal attention is 3 times more impactful than ease of doing things. That's where you want to use quantitative research. Why? You could get it out of qualitative research, but then again, your colleagues from other departments will challenge you and say, hey, but it was only 8 customers, so how do we know for sure that it really matters most? So the biggest mistake I see in qualitative research is that it's being used to find what matters most. That's a risk. So the order of research should be flipped around. So if you want to understand what matters most, that's where quantitative research is super valuable. If then you want to say, hey, but within personal attention, what are ideas that customers have or what does it mean to them? So to deep dive, that's where qualitative research definitely is valuable. And also for really service design, if you want to completely innovate your services and products, then of course also qualitative research is really valuable. But just for journey research and for understanding what to improve, I definitely advise to use quantitative research. So the fourth topic is the difference between emotional and subconscious needs versus rational and, let's say, more transactional needs. And as you've learned already from the part of NPS and finding the drivers, too much research is focusing on the rational side. So you're asking customers or you're asking employees what matters most to you. So I start thinking about it. I start rationalizing my answer. And so also in qualitative research, but also when you're asking questions in a survey, when it's just an open text, hey, what is important to you? You definitely get the risk of only getting rational answers. For example, customer will say it's all about price. Employees might say it's about salary. Trust me, it's never about price. It's never about salary. As you want to make sure that you design your research in such a way that you get to the latent subconscious needs. And the last one is really closely related to the previous one I just mentioned. So rational and latent needs is also really connected to transaction and emotion. And so make sure that you're not only focusing your research on the transactional side, speed of doing things, ease of doing things, clarity of, for example, the digital journey. Make sure that you also figure out, okay, but what emotional elements of the journey matters most to customers and also to employees. Because what we tend to see is that the number one driver is always on the emotional and human level, and it's almost never on the transactional digital level. So these 5 tips, whenever you're designing research, and as an employee and customer experience professional, you cannot do without research, right? So use these tips to either inform your research agency to, let's say, let them level up the quality of research. As I promised in the introduction, apart from these 5 tips to enhance the quality of the research, there are also 5 key metrics that are really easy and impactful, but that nobody is using. The first tip and the key metric that nobody is using, that has to do with the time that a journey takes. And it's an example from, let's say, way back in the day. I think it was one of my first experiences with using and experiencing the strength of the journey map. So I was working in an insurance company, and we were working on complaints handling. And it was really a struggle to get the operational director to be, let's say, convinced that complaints handling was worth his time. Because what was he saying? You know, I have 100,000 customers, only maybe I get 100 complaints on 100,000 customers, so not really a priority. So I thought, okay, how can I convince this and show a different perspective? So what I started doing is, I forgot to explain that the number one complaint that his department got was around ending life insurance. And the complaint was that it either took too long or it didn't happen at all. So I thought, okay, let me start just figuring out the journey. And what I just did, and I think it took me like 1 or 2 hours, I just visited the different departments and asked each department, okay, how long is your step in the process in the journey taking? So we had maybe the customer service, we had a department that needed to check, let's say, the legal side of the policy, we had the department that needed to finance the insurance policy, etc. And when I did that analysis and I added up all different steps, because maybe you recognize that sometimes internal departments have something that's called SLA, right? They have this internal service level agreement where they say, okay, each department can take, 24 hours or 3 days. And they are managing their own SLA, and all those SLAs were green, right? So there was no department that was taking too much time. So again, this director was saying, I don't have an issue. But what happened is when you analyze the journey from all those departments and you add up the total time became 38 working days, which means roughly 8 weeks. Could be a conscious choice, but when customers would call the customer service, the agent would tell them, yes, dear Zanna, this will be fixed in the next 10 working days. So when we shared that analysis with the director, that's where he really saw the added value, because this to him was a new perspective. So whenever you are analyzing the journey, don't just fall for checking the internal total time for each step in the journey. Just make sure from a customer perspective, across all the steps, what is the total time that it takes? Are we communicating that time? And are we okay with that time? Right, so that's the first metric that's really valuable to add to your collection of metrics. The second metric is one that I've used that's really a good mix for proving the cost reduction potential for a better experience. It's called first time right, and it's not the same as first time fix. So you probably know first time fix. That means, hey, how many calls of customers are we answering in one go, right? So I don't have to call again. You should definitely measure that because it's a driver, but most companies are measuring it. First time fix is something that I created when I was responsible for, this was a Dutch insurance company, and I was responsible for a program that was looking for how can we reduce the costs of the call center. And if you know me by now a little, I don't want to do that by putting the phone number like 5 layers deep somewhere on the website. I want to do that by enhancing the experience of customers. Because I was convinced that cost reduction and a good customer experience are a win-win, especially in contact centers. But I had no idea what the potential was. So what I thought of, I said, hey, let's start by asking the customers the question, dear customer, do you think we could have prevented this call? So we were already measuring on a weekly basis how satisfied customers were with the call center, and we just added in this question. And then the 30%, so we've now measured it across different organizations, every time between 30 and 40% of customers are saying, yes, this call could have been prevented. That means you have 20 to 40% business case. So let's say you have 1 million calls a year at €10 per call. That's 10 million cost in your call center. If 40% of customers are saying, maybe I didn't want to call because I could have done it on the website, or I don't know, the letter was not clear, that's a 4 million potential business case. And you will never need 4 million to enhance this specific journey. So adding first time right is a perfect example of making CX also really, again, tangible in financial impact of improving the experience while reducing costs. So the third tip, I see a lot of CX professionals struggling in how do I prioritize? How do I prioritize? So maybe I have, 30 journeys. What's the best way and a pragmatic way to start choosing with which journey to start? So of course you can make a whole list of criteria, but 2 small, simple tips is 1, check how many customers per year are going through this journey. If you have a journey that 100,000 customers go through, it might have more priority than if only 5,000 customers go through it. And that's a very simple, easy check. The second one to add is to also check for each journey, how many calls is that journey generating? And here again, you can say the journey that's generating the most calls might get more priority than if we don't get a lot of questions about that journey. So number of customers plus number of calls are very simple starting points to have some idea of prioritization. And of course, you can also think, for example, about strategic choices. Maybe there's a small customer group, or there's a specific journey that's maybe super painful if something goes wrong. And then you can also sort of flag that journey and say, hey, maybe it's not the most amount of customers, maybe it's not the most amount of calls, but it's a very painful and therefore strategic journey. So that's also a reason why we prioritize that journey. So the fourth one is one that I see often, especially when there are companies that have a very large call center. So they are very customer service driven. They are really focused on how can we enhance the customer service, like the call experience. And they should, right? Whenever a customer calls you, you want to be there. That's a moment of truth. But what they overestimate is the impact of the call center on the customer. So one of the first questions that I tend to ask is, did you analyze what percentage of all your customers on a yearly basis are actually calling you? They give 2 answers. One is that they often did not check this percentage. But more importantly, what you tend to see is that between maybe 15 and 20% of customers are actually calling you. That means for 80 to 85% of your customers, you are not making them more happy by having an amazing customer service, right? You need to create something else for them to also elevate their experience. And so just looking at the percentage of how many customers are calling us, visiting us, are actually interacting with us, is really crucial to understand the impact of the different channels, but also, hey, what percentage of customers are we not reaching? So we need to figure out something else with that group of customers. Last but not least, also a really simple but impactful metric is maybe you know it, it's called the Pareto principle. The principle is that there's always a 20-80 rule. So you could check, is 20% of my customers responsible for 80% of my calls? If that's the case, and you can zoom in on that 20% and understand why they're calling, you'll have a huge impact and reduce those 80% of the calls. Are 20% of my journeys responsible for 80% of my revenue? Right, so you can use the 20-80 principle for many different ways, and it's a really fast way to zoom in on those journeys or those groups of customers, those types of calls that have the biggest impact. So 20-80 is definitely a tip. And maybe what's also funny is that when we do the journey workshops, both for employees and customers, we have a few mantras. And one of the mantras is that we also say 20-80. Because when you start doing journey workshops, you get a lot of exceptions. So you start talking about, hey, you know, the customer goes through this journey, but sometimes also this and this can happen. So we always say, hey, 20-80. So when people say sometimes or you feel it's an exception, I always pause them and ask, okay, is this example that you mentioned, is it in 20% of the cases or is it in 80% of the cases? Because we want to map the journey for, let's say, the average customers. And then a lot of participants of the journey workshop say afterwards that 20-80, I'm going to use that much more. So enjoy using the 20-80 in multiple ways. So with these 5, tips of how to enhance the quality of your research, and these 5 metrics that are really simple but impactful, I hope you can enhance your, let's say, your more numbers-driven approach, so you can convince the more numbers-driven colleagues and enhance the business impact in your organization. It's a wrap. I hope that you're still with me. If not, you can also watch this, of course, in parts. So this is the first ultimate guide for CX and EX metrics. If this was valuable to you, then please just like and subscribe. Not to enhance my ego, but that's just help the YouTube algorithm to spread out this content. And one of my goals is to share the content with as many people as possible. Also, I reference, I think, 2 SlideShare videos that might be relevant. One is the 5 types of experience. It's actually 3, I think, that are relevant to you. The 5 types of experience. One is where I share the NPS toolkit, so you have even more details on the pros and cons of the NPS. And one short video where I have a visual explanation of this driver analysis slide that I shared with you. So I hope this was valuable. If yes, then there are 2 more that we'll be recording. The ultimate guide for journey mapping and journey management, and the ultimate guide to CX transformation. So hope to see you there.